Hey, Anna. In 3 weeks, I haven't called on anyone yet. Or you ready to sit there? I can still see you just as well. I can call on you. Oh, cool. Yeah, of course. She came to our Wednesday night class for a good spell. We'll tell her I said hello. Okay, as usual, thanks for joining us, and we have a microphone for any questions or comments you have. Helen has volunteered to bring you the mic so that you can use it, so that not just everybody at home on Zoom can hear your question or comment, but also everyone here in the worship center. There will be at one point tonight. I will just kind of have you shout out a question or comment, and I'll repeat them back. But for the most part, we'll try to use the mic. And again, if you don't want to use the mic for any reason, then don't let that keep you from making a comment or asking a question. Feel free to, raise your hand, and I'll repeat it back for everyone. But if you do that, keep it short and sweet so that I can repeat it back for everyone. All right, tonight, you may have seen my email. We got a couple stories to cover before we get to probably the main part of our discussion tonight. We'll focus on the story that is kind of on the screen right here is the title card or title slide, which is the binding of Isaac or the sacrifice of Isaac or Abraham's test. It's called a number of different things that refer to that, and we'll talk about that. But we'll spend a good part of our discussion tonight on that story. So kind of getting us caught up, of course, we've talked about Abraham, how he traveled from the land he was born in, the land of his people. That's kind of represented. Oh, do we have the slides, Rob? That's represented on the map here. On the far bottom right is the number 1. And then travels up and around down to the promised land, which is kind of where like the 3 and the 5 are, that area. We saw him go to Egypt and have the encounter with Pharaoh where he tells Sarah, hey, say you're my sister, not my wife. And then they come back to the promised land after that. Pharaoh sends them back with a lot of riches. And as we'll see tonight, it seems like Abraham just keeps growing in wealth and prosperity. But he's back in the land that has been promised to him and his descendants. We get that in this first initial promise, that it's important to keep this in mind tonight as we talk about the story of Abraham and Isaac. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country. That should be like, go forth from your country, and we'll come back to that word tonight too. Go forth from your country, your people and your father's household, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So again, with these promises to Abraham, we have our 2 main focuses for Genesis coming about, where we talk about the separation that keeps happening between humans and God and humans with each other. So there's a separation that keeps happening, and God is working to get those fixed. And it's going to, that keeps playing out in a number of different ways, that God is working to reunify, to reconcile himself to us as humans, and to help us as humans be reconciled, reunified in togetherness with each other. So that's one of the main focuses of the author of Genesis. The other, of course, is what he starts with. He makes something from nothing, and he turns nobodies into somebodies. And so chapter 12 here is kind of the beginning of chapter 12 is the promise of both those. Sorry, I went back. There we go. This is Abraham looking up towards the stars that God has said, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the heavens, as numerous as the sand on the seashores. And so the promises to Abraham are God's one of God's ways that he is bringing back humanity to himself and humanity amongst each other, that through Abraham, he will be a blessing to all nations, and essentially that all nations will be blessed or reconciled to God because of Abraham and because of his descendants. And of course, that comes about because God is taking a nobody like Abraham and turning him into a somebody. And we see that with his descendants as well. So when they came back from Egypt, we have the story of Sarah presenting Hagar, her maidservant, her employee. Oftentimes our English will translate it as slave, but it's really not that harsh. We will see at one point tonight that Sarah does call her that, kind of in an insulting way, but really she's some kind of servant that Pharaoh has given to Abraham and to Sarah to take with them, amongst many other maidservants and men servants. So she says, sleep with Hagar, have a child with Hagar, and that'll be the child of God's promise. Because remember, at this point, God hasn't promised anything to Sarah. God hasn't told Sarah that she would be the one that would give birth to the promised descendant of Abraham, just that Abraham is supposed to have a descendant. So she gives Hagar to Abraham. She conceives Ishmael. She goes out into the wilderness once Sarah starts mistreating or abusing her, and Abraham doesn't say anything. He lets it happen. She goes out into the wilderness, and God sees her there. We had this slide from last week that Hagar flees to the desert. She finds water. And then we have this, then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. So again, the summary is kind of Sarai abuses, Hagar flees, the Lord finds. And of course, that's when we have Hagar given the promise by God to her that she is going to give birth, and he'll make her son into a great nation as well. And then she says, you are the God who sees me. So an invisible woman is seen by the invisible God. And God makes her visible to the world by his promise to her that she'll make her son Ishmael, which means God hears, into a great nation as well. So any just questions or comments on that quick summary before we actually start our stories tonight? Okay. So in chapter 17 is where we're going to pick up our stories. And again, I'm going to be reading from the NIV, but I'm not going to read every single verse, but I'll tell you where I'm skipping to here. So chapter 17, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. So the name Abram, which means like exalted father, goes to Abraham, which means like father of many. So he changes his name here. And we see that a number of times. We talked the very first week about a story that's still coming up next week, but we alluded to it with God wrestling with Jacob at the Jabbok River, and then changing his name from Jacob, which means like deceiver or trickster, to Israel, which means something like struggles with God, wrestles with God, or the God fighter. So it's really important, the names in the Bible, and we'll talk more about that specifically next week, and the changing of names as well. So he tells Abram, you'll no longer be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I've made you a father of many nations. Verse 6, I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. So again, this land of Canaan, as it's now called, will be the promised land that the Israelite people under the leadership of Moses and Joshua will return to later to take possession of. So God says, you're a foreigner in that land right now, but at some point this land will belong to your descendants. Verse 9, God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. So one thing I mentioned before, that a lot of times, particularly Jewish scholars or writers, when they look at Scripture, they're always asking why. They look for something that doesn't make sense, or they look at something that's missing in the text, or seems to be missing in the text, and they ask why. Why is that? So one of the questions, of course, is why circumcision? If God created male and female, in the beginning, and he meant for males to be circumcised, why didn't he create males circumcised? What is this act that's now taking place later? And in Jewish tradition, the idea is that it gives humans the opportunity to complete creation. So in the garden, Adam and Eve are given the opportunity to continue the creative process by naming the animals and tending to the animals and everything that's living in the garden. They were invited to continue that creative process. Circumcision is often seen as the completion of the creation process. That when males are circumcised, it's humans entering into the creative process with God and finishing the act of creation by circumcising their males. Now, normally that's going to be done when the males are like 8 days old. At this point, Abraham is 99 years old, and God is telling them that everybody in his family here is to be circumcised. Verse 15, God also said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. So now Sarah is given the promise that she is the one that's supposed to be the one who gives birth to the son of Abraham that will lead to all these descendants. So in this name change here, I understand you don't read Hebrew, but I put this up just to show you in Jewish tradition what they see in these name changes. So at the top of the screen, you'll see the Hebrew word for Yahweh or Jehovah there. And in the boxes are like basically the letter H in Hebrew. I mean, it looks a little like an H, which is helpful for us, in those boxes at the top. It's basically the letter H. In the name Yahweh or Jehovah, those letters represent the life of God, the breath of God. And so you'll notice that when Abram's name goes to Abraham, it's adding that H. And so for Sarai, when her name is changed, it's also adding the H to Sarah. It helps that it works out a little bit for us in the English like it does in the Hebrew there. But the important thing to know is for the Jewish reader or listener that those sounds, those letters represent the breath of God. So God changing Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah is instilling his very being into them with that name change. And that's solidified here with the covenant promises that he is repeating to Abraham and now giving to Sarah. Verse 17, Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abram said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. So Abram, he laughs, first of all, which is we're going to find out that his son Isaac, his name means something like laughter, or God laughs, or he laughs, or something like that. So this is the first instance of that's kind of a telling. If you're the reader and listener this is being written to at the time Moses is writing, or a later reader, you know about Isaac already, and you know that his name means laughter. So when it says that Abraham laughs at the idea that a son would be born to him, it's kind of a funny or ironic little take there for the reader and listener. But Abraham laughs, saying, how ridiculous that you would say that I'm going to have a son at 100, Sarah's going to give birth to a son at 90. Why don't you just make Ishmael the the promised descendant. That's in Abraham's mind. That makes all the sense in the world. I already have a son. And that son, if you just bless that son can be the child of promise. Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Again, remember, Ishmael means God hears. I have heard you about Ishmael. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear you by this time next year. When he had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. Verse 27, and every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his household or brought from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. So males of all ages at that point are circumcised, including at this point Ishmael, who is 13 years old. So Ishmael's 13. He's one of the ones that is circumcised here with the males of Abraham's household. I still have this slide, but it's probably bright in your face, huh? Oh, that one's not that much better. Oh, well. Well, again, Abraham says, I already got a son. Why don't just make him the son of the promise, the one the descendants will come from, the one that you've given the promises about. And he says, don't worry about him. I've heard you. I've heard your concern about Ishmael. I'm going to make, and he basically reiterates the promise to Abraham that God already gave to Hagar, that he's going to make Ishmael into a great nation. And in fact, it even says that from Ishmael will be 12 sons or 12 rulers. It's the same amount of sons and rulers that are going to come from Jacob that make the 12 tribes of Israel. So 12 is a significant number here in the fact that God is saying, I'm going to make Ishmael into a great nation. And if you're the reader and listener at the time this is being written, you know that you are part of one of those 12 tribes. And you know that you are part of one of Jacob's 12 sons and descendants. And that's what makes up the chosen people of God. So God's saying, I'm going to make Ishmael descendants, or 12 sons and descendants as well, is a sign of God's continuing promise and provision for Abraham's other son, Ishmael, here. Are there any questions or comments just on that circumcision part of the story or any of that before we get into chapter 18? Anybody on Zoom, just feel free to at any time type in your question or comment, and Rob will shout it out to us. Yeah. What's that? Oh, are we ever told the names of those 12 sons of Ishmael? Yeah, it's actually coming. We might get to it at the end of tonight real quickly. If not, we'll talk about it first thing next week. But yes, we are told about Ishmael's sons. Anything else? So we'll talk when we get there about who they become and why that's important, particularly when in terms of God's chosen people even to this day and age. Yeah, Larry? Does it tell us where Ishmael and his sons settled? Yeah, it tells us they settle basically out in the wilderness, in the desert, the Negev area of Israel. They're going to settle out there. It says he's going to become an archer. He kind of lives off the land and teaches that to his sons. So we do know that they settled there. I do have a map that's towards the end of tonight, or it'll be at the start of next week, that does show where eventually all of Ishmael's sons settle, even to today, where people trace their lineage back to Ishmael. So you may or may not already know that, yeah, Ishmael's sons are where almost every Arab person in the world today traces their lineage. They trace their lineage back to Ishmael and, of course, Abraham, his father, just as Jewish people trace their lineage back to Abraham through Isaac. So the people in our world today that are living in Arab countries would all trace their lineage to Ishmael. Any other question or comment?
Quick question.
Yeah, Becky?
Was circumcision...
I don't think our mic's on. Hold on a second.
Is
on
it
now?
on? It's on now, right? No? Okay. Yeah. Was circumcision something new to the world, or
You're going to have to shout for me, too.
Can you?
Oh, was circumcision new to the world? No, it was not. Circumcision was happening at that time with other surrounding people groups already. The point at which they practiced it or did the circumcision varied, but it was not something that was a brand new idea or would have been a brand new idea for Abraham at the time.
There was a question about God's plan for Isaac. I don't know if you mentioned it already. What was God's plan for Isaac?
So say it again.
What is God's plan for Isaac?
Oh, what is God's plan for Isaac? Oh, wow. Well, I guess the simplest way to answer that is just to say that he is going to be the continuation of the promise from Abraham. So when God promises to Abraham, remember in our slide that he promises him a nation, he promises a name, and he promises a blessing. And those are fulfilled in different ways too. Abraham's descendants becoming a nation really is fulfilled finally with Moses and leading the Israelites out of Egypt and being the 12 tribes coming into the promised land, that they established the nation of Israel. And so that is fulfilled in him. With the name promise, that's really going to come to fruition with David, because King David will establish the Davidic dynasty, the line of David, and the successive kings after him. And so that is an eternal promise of a name that God gives to Abraham too. So his plan for Isaac is really a continuation of that. Now, it's a generic question you ask, but it's actually a great question, and we're going to see more of Isaac next week. But it really gets into who was Isaac and why. We have a very short amount of stories about Isaac. We have a significant number of stories about Abraham, as we've seen. We'll have a significant number of stories about Jacob and even about Joseph and his brothers. We have very little about Isaac, and it is because he kind of is a non-actor. We'll see actually that his wife Rebekah is much more of an actor in our stories. She is the one doing stuff, whereas Isaac just kind of, I don't want to say he lays about, but that's kind of the picture that we get from the author of Genesis. So it's interesting to look at Isaac and try to see, well, what was God's plan with Isaac? Because he doesn't seem to do much, but certainly he is part of God's plan and continuing the promises that are originally given to Abraham. So, but the story we're going to focus on tonight, we'll actually maybe see a different side of Isaac. Any other question or comment? Yeah, Anna? Yeah, the question was, did Abraham and Sarah disobey God by using Hagar? I know what you mean. It's actually a funny way to ask the question. I think there's a kind of a double meaning there. Yes, they did use her. They used her as an instrument or a tool. And I think from our perspective, we would certainly say that was wrong. But the author of Genesis makes no judgment about that. And in fact, from the author of Genesis' perspective, what Sarah did was there's nothing that we can say that she did wrong or disobedient, because, again, the promise had not been given to her yet. All she knew was that the promise had been given to Abraham for a son. And so she does what she needs. In her mind, she does what she needs to do to make sure that happens. We're going to see the same thing come about with Rebekah next week. She does what needs to be done to make sure that promise happens. And for the author of Genesis, it's hard to say that he condones that behavior, but he certainly doesn't condemn it. We're going to have a really good example of that here in a minute, too, with another story we're going to look at. But I've said this before, and it's I think sometimes hard for us to always follow along in the story of Genesis, where the author of Genesis, there's no moral codes in the book of Genesis. There's no like doctrine and theology about right living and all that. The author of Genesis, that's not to say those things didn't exist and that we can't say, oh, that was wrong for that person to do that. But what we can say is the author of Genesis makes no distinctions between like those kind of things. For the author of Genesis, just here's a bunch of nobodies God's turned into somebodies. Sometimes they're terrible people. Sometimes they're good people. but God is working in all of them. And I think for a lot of us, there's a comfort to that. You know, there's a comfort to knowing that, hey, Abraham wasn't chosen because he's this amazing guy that was already doing great stuff, or that any of these people that God uses throughout the book of Genesis to bless the entire world and bring salvation in the entire world, that they were nobodies. And it was only by God acting through them that they really were anything special. And so for the author of Genesis, he certainly wouldn't say that Abraham or Sarah disobeyed God by using Hagar. I think we can look back and say the mistreatment and abuse of Hagar is wrong, but the actually having her, and certainly she didn't seem to have any choice in the matter of getting pregnant by Abraham, but the idea that they would suggest it is not judged as disobedience by the author of Genesis, at least. All right, in chapter 18, we have this very strange story. We'll go through it quickly. Just from the slide that's up, you can see there's 3 people that come to the tent, that Abraham, who is there bowing in front of them, and then Sarah is in the background there, just outside the tent. So there's 3 visitors. In chapter 18, the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great tree of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. A couple interesting things about this. We haven't seen God really interact with humans on a very personal, intimate way since the garden. You know, it says that God walked in the garden with Adam and Eve and spoke friendly with them in the cool of the day or the cool of the evening. It's interesting here that it says it's the heat of the day when Abraham encounters these 3 visitors, one of which it seems from what the author's telling us is God being amongst Abraham at the tent. Here's a picture from, there was a series on TV a couple years ago called, I think it was just called The Bible. It was put out by like Mark Burnett, who's like the executive producer of like Survivor and Amazing Race, and his wife Roma Downey, who was in the Touched by an Angel show. They executive produced this Bible mini-series. And so this is kind of a picture from a still from that, just showing the visitors actually sitting in the tent with Abraham, which would have been incredibly important. In the ancient Near Eastern culture and society, the idea of hospitality and welcoming people into your tent was extremely significant. And there was an idea of protection in somebody's tent. That's why when you look at Psalm 23, that even though, prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies, is because if you went into somebody's tent and were being hosted by them, even if you were an outlaw, fugitive on the run, and the people came to get you, they had to wait outside the tent until you came out. They could not go inside the tent into that person's tent and break hospitality laws. So the picture from Psalm 23 is like you're sitting there having a meal, your enemies are standing outside the tent looking in at you, watching you, but you have a table prepared before you. And so the idea of hospitality, you could see that just from the last slide too, that Abraham rushes out to greet these 3 visitors. And at this point, there's nothing that the author has told us that we're privy to the information that seemingly one of them is God, and we'll see the other 2 are seemingly messengers of God or angels. But Abraham doesn't seem to know that at this point. He just sees 3 visitors and rushes out to them. Verse 9, skip to verse 9. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, now will I now have this pleasure." So this picture here is showing Sarah. Again, if you're the reader and listener, already you had Abraham laugh, and now you have Sarah laugh. And, of course, the kind of play on words there is that Isaac's name means laughter, or he laughed. So Sarah laughs here, says, can't really believe it. But one of the visitors says to Abraham, by this time next year, it's going to happen. which is interesting because this has been promised for a long time. This has been many years that this promise had been in place by God. And Abraham has been told, you're going to have a son that, is that I'm going to continue the promise through. And then he has Ishmael, and it's like God says, well, not that son. You're going to have a different son. And he was like, oh, man, I still got to wait. And so it's like, okay. So finally, this says, by this time next year, it's going to happen. Verse 16, when the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised. Now, this is an interesting picture of God. It's almost like this self-inner monologue of God, or he's kind of really talking to the other two messengers that are with him. He's saying, shouldn't I inform Abraham about what I'm going to do with Sodom and Gomorrah? Sodom and Gomorrah at this point, it's kind of been judged that they're beyond repair. They've, again, this idea of separation that we see in the book of Genesis. They're so separated from God and really separated from each other as humans that, Sodom and Gomorrah need to be destroyed. So God says, isn't it right that I should involve Abraham with this? It's an interesting change from how God has interacted with humans before this, particularly somebody like, Adam in the garden, and then especially Noah. Noah was a yes man, and that was one of his biggest strengths. It says over and over in chapter 6 in Genesis, when we looked at it, that Noah did exactly what God commanded, and Noah did exactly what God commanded, and Noah did exactly what God commanded him. And then after the flood happens, Noah kind of creates a mess after that. And so it didn't really work out for God to have just a yes man. So he now says, I'm going to talk to Abraham about this. I'm planning to destroy these two cities and everyone in them. I'm going to isn't it right that I should tell Abraham and talk with him about it? So the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down to see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. Verse 22, the men turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of the earth do right? The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Skip down to verse 32. But basically, Abraham is negotiating with God. If there's 50 righteous people, will you spare it? Yeah, I'll spare 50. What about 45? What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? And God each time says, yes, 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 yes. Finally, if there's 10 righteous people, I'll spare it. Verse 32, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if 10 can be found there? For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. Verse 33, when the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. So God tells Abraham of this plan, and basically, immediately, Abraham challenges God about it. That doesn't sound like you, God. That doesn't sound like something you would do. If there's righteous people in that city, you shouldn't destroy everybody in the city, including them. So if there's righteous people to be found in those cities, you should spare it. Abraham is challenging God here, saying, that's not the type of God that I know you to be. So he does this bartering and arguing with God. If you find 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, will you spare the city? And each time God says, yep. If there's that many there, then I'll act like you're expecting me to act and do what you're expecting me to do. Let's see here. Oh, I've forgotten to go that side. Here's Abraham just arguing with God or negotiating with God. So chapter 19, the two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. So Abraham's nephew Lot lives in the city there. In fact, he's sitting at the gateway of the city, which tells us he's somebody important in the city. If you judges sit in the gates of the city, important people, elders sit in the gates of the city. Anybody who plays a prominent role in any city sits in the gate to hear what's going on in the city, to judge things that are going on in the city. So Lot sitting in the gateway of the city tells he's, at this point, somebody important here. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. My lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go on your way early in the morning. So Lot jumps up to be hospitable just like his uncle Abraham had done. I don't think Lot knew they were this, Abraham had done it with these exact same people or messengers or visitors, but he acts in a hospitable, expected way. Verse 3, but he insisted so strong, no, they answered, we will spend the night in the square. But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baked bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we can have sex with them. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind them and said, no, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them what you like. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Here's another slide. I mentioned last week this book called The Awkward Moments Children's Bible. And it purposely takes kind of horrendous scenes like this and cartoonizes, if that's a word, them. And it's not supposed to be making fun of the Bible. It's actually just meant to get us to think. So here's this kind of horrific scene. I mentioned before that there's an author named Phyllis Tribal who has a book called Texts of Terror about certain stories in the Old Testament. And certainly I think this would probably qualify in our minds as a text of terror. These men of Sodom come to Lot's house and say, hey, we saw those visitors show up. Send them out so we can rape them. And Lot says, oh, no, don't do that. We got all these hospitality rules here in the ancient East. Hey, I've got 2 daughters. I'll just send them out. You can rape them all you want. That's basically what he says to them. And so here's this, scene here in this Awkward Moments Children's Bible. It's got the verses up there. But it's a horrific scene. And it's only made more horrific by the fact that the men of the city refuse that. They want to rape the men who came. So I think it's partly to show us just how bad the cities had gotten. It's supposed to show us the absolute deprivation of Sodom and Gomorrah at this point. What's happening. Now, that certainly doesn't excuse what Lot did. You can imagine if you're one of his daughters, just go like, Dad? I heard what he said out there. I don't know where they were when he told them this or anything, or if they overheard it, but that would be an awkward conversation. But it's a horrific thing that Lot does by offering them. And, a lot of people in commentator sense have said, well, he was justifying because the laws of hospitality demanded that he protect the men, and obviously laws of hospitality demand he protects the men, but not at the expense of his daughters here. So it's certainly a terrible story and picture, but the picture, of course, again, is just how bad the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah had gotten at this point. So, before I move on, is there any questions or comments about that? I know if the story is a little startling, and I think it's meant to be. Yeah, I wish we knew that. Would he have offered sons if he had sons? He certainly treats them as an instrument or tool, like Abraham and Sarah treated Hagar like an instrument or tool, something to be used. He has sons-in-law, but he doesn't. We're not told that he has sons in this instance. So yeah, it's a good question. We don't know if he would have offered sons if he had sons, or if it's just daughters he would offer. We don't know. Either way, a terrible picture here. Skipping down to verse 23. Well, first I'll just say, the two visitors, these angels, these visitors, basically then tell Lot, you got to get out of here. You know, the city's done for at this point. The men outside are struck blind by the visitors here. That's the picture that is up on the screen, this painting. The men of the city are now struck blind. The visitors, the angels tell, the messengers of God tell Lot, you got to get your family out of here. You know, take your daughters, if they'll go with you, take your daughters and your sons-in-law and your wife, and you got to get out of here. So they start to go in verse 23. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and all the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Here's Lot's wife in modern-day Israel. This rock formation that is called Lot's wife. It's by the Dead Sea. You can't tell really from this picture because there's nothing to scale. That's about 60 feet high, that rock structure that's in the middle that kind of just looks like a person standing there. The interesting thing is we don't know which came first. We don't know if they called this Lot's wife because of the story or if the story actually came from this rock structure. We know just from archaeology that this rock structure was it was basically a column holding up a roof. You can kind of see to the right of it, our right, the rest of that structure that was being held up as just not a man-made structure, but a natural structure. The top 1/3 of Lot's wife, that rock structure, is like capstone, and the bottom half is all salt, which is prominent around the Dead Sea. There's all kinds of salt formations and structures around the Dead Sea. We actually know that it was like a pillar holding up that part of the rock structure. The reason it all collapsed is because of an earthquake about 4,000 years ago, which is about the time of Sodom and Gomorrah. So the idea that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by this kind of burning sulfur rock, most people look back at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and think that it was partly due to an earthquake. The timeline kind of matches up. So it could be that this rock formation formed and it just kind of became a legend that it was Lot's wife, and we have that as part of the story. Because we're not really told what the deal with that is. Like, she turns and looks back around like any of us would, and it's like she's turned into a pillar of salt. I think modern day we've always wanted to take that part of the story and say, oh, she was being disobedient or something to God. But there wasn't really, despite how we translate in English, there wasn't really any direct command to not do that. They just said, get out of here, run away and flee. But the fact that she's turning a pillar of salt kind of seems a little unfair, I think, for a lot of us to read this story. I think part of the reason it's included is to contrast it with Abraham. Abraham looks at the city and is not turned into a pillar of salt. The difference is Abraham is standing with God and Lot's wife is not. So I think that's probably the main reason the author of Genesis kind of includes that part of the story here. Early the next morning, Abram got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. This is in verse 28. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Now another very bizarre, kind of troubling story here. Verse 30, Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar, the city that they had fled to, and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father drunk to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father. So both of Lot's, verse 36, so both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites today. So in the painting that's up on the screen right now is, Lot and his 2 daughters kind of outside this cave. They're looking back at the destroyed city of Sodom and Gomorrah. It might be a little hard for you to see there on the upper far right, but that's what they're pointing to, this destroyed, kind of burning, smoking, looking like a furnace city of Sodom or Gomorrah that they're looking back at there. And then, of course, the next one is them getting their father to drink wine, get him drunk. It's kind of an interesting turnabout here where basically Lot, who had offered his daughters up to be sexually assaulted, are now the ones who sexually assault him. And so it's kind of ironic, for at least from the author of Genesis point of view. This is another one of those stories that we look at Genesis and we're a little frustrated because there's no judgment on them. They're never condemned by the author of Genesis for what they did. In fact, if anything, the author of Genesis would probably say it was a good thing. Now, the daughters seem to be under the impression that there's no other men left in the world. If they know the story of Noah, they might think that this has happened again. Despite the promise with the rainbow and everything else in that story, everything they know in their city that they have lived in their entire life is now destroyed. And in fact, they see another city nearby that's destroyed. And in their mind, they just may think, God's doing this all over again. There's nobody left in the entire earth except this one male who happens to be our father. So they say, if we're going to continue the human species, or at least our family line, he's our only option. And for the author of Genesis, there's not really any judgment there about what they did, which is a little odd for us, I think. We would want this to be like, they're being sinful or whatever else we want to read into it and see some kind of judgment there. But there's no judgment from the author of Genesis. In fact, what he tells us about what happens is kind of like the author of Genesis not saying what they did was good, but I think the author of Genesis would say, it was a good thing. Because here's what happens. The older daughter gives birth to a son, names him Moab. Then tells us he became the father of the Moabites. There was later on in the story of the Israelite people, in the chosen people of God's story, there is a woman named Ruth who is a Moabite. She comes from the land of Moab, and she is a Moabite. Ruth goes with Naomi back to Bethlehem. She marries a man named Boaz. Boaz and Ruth have a grandson named David, and that's King David. So for the author of Genesis, he's like, hey, this is just what happened. Here's the story. Here's what happened. I'm not saying what they did was good, but hey, look, something good came of it. It's a good thing that it happened because it leads to King David. It's one of the more impressive, I think, aspects of Matthew's genealogy in his gospel. When he mentioned, I always liked Jim Price when he would preach on the genealogy in Matthew's gospel, and he would talk about the women that are mentioned in that genealogy, because it's like, these are people and women you specifically want to leave out of your family tree. And especially if you're trying to make the case that this person being born is the Messiah. That's somebody you want to leave out of your story. But not Matthew. He says, hey, David is part of this. His grandmother was Ruth. She was a Moabite. This is where the Moabites came from. Lot's daughters raped them. That's where they came from. And so for the author of Genesis, it's just kind of a simple fact, and there's not judgment either way there. Just, this is what happened. It turned out great. Why? Because God makes nobodies into somebodies. That's why. And the separation that occurs from Sodom and Gomorrah between God and humanity and humans from each other, after all, the men of Sodom came there, wanted to rape the men that were there, and Lot offered them his daughters, and they refused and were struck blind. There's separation obviously there between humans if they're willing to treat each other like that. And how are humans going to be reunified with each other and with God? Through the promises given to Abraham, which includes David. So again, it's kind of a startling and troubling story, but certainly fitting with the author of Genesis, his purposes of showing separation and reconciliation that God brings about and turning nobodies into somebodies. Yeah, Rob, somebody on Zoom?
Yeah, Corey and Grace, I think you kind of touched on it, but they said, wouldn't the daughters be punished for doing that sinful thing? Why would God allow that?
Well, I think there's a kind of difference. I don't know about the why would God allow that part. I mean, obviously God allows humans to act in a lot of terrible ways that he doesn't put a stop to. So I don't know about allows, but the idea of him not, like I said, we want there to be punishment to that. That's not a good thing that they did, and I think it's right for us to look back and say, yeah, we can say that's not a good thing to happen. And so we want there to be judgment and punishment there, but the author of Genesis doesn't offer it to us. And I think, again, that's a frustrating thing when we do go through the book of Genesis, is all these terrible things that humans do oftentimes, there's not a whole lot of moral judgment or moral code to be found in the book of Genesis. Now, certainly that's to be found elsewhere in the Old Testament. We certainly see that come about beginning with Exodus with, God brings a moral code to his people with the 10 commandments and the other 603 commandments. There's a moral code there that's brought. So certainly that's part of, the Old Testament story that we read, but the author of Genesis doesn't include a whole lot of that. His approach is kind of just laid bare. Here's the things that are happening. Here's how God's working among those things. Any other question or comments on those stories? So
yeah, there's kind of a follow-up on that.
Sure.
Would that be considered part of God's plan also if it led to David's genealogy?
I would certainly say it's part of his plan that David is a result of that, but I don't know it's fair to say that as part of God's plan included the idea that Lot would be sexually assaulted by his daughters and have descendants by them. So I think it's tough for us to say, yes, that was something that God had planned. Like he thought, hey, this is a good idea. Let's have this be how David comes about eventually. And I don't think the author of Genesis sees it that way. I think as Christians, that's something later on we like to try to project back into the story sometimes, that we want there to always be a reason for something, and that because we believe that God is in control, we oftentimes want that to mean that God is in control of every little thing, or wants to be in control of every little thing. So sometimes as Christians, I think we read back into a story like this to say, well, that God planned for Lot to be raped by his daughters, and that was just part of God's plan, good and perfect plan. But I think that's unfair to say that the author of Genesis thought that way, and certainly I think for most Jewish people, they don't think of it that way. Again, I think in other parts of the Hebrew Scripture in the Old Testament, certainly in the New Testament, you can make those kind of moral judgments. But for Genesis, part of the reason Genesis is frustrating sometimes is because the author doesn't give us those moral judgments. We want the bad people to be punished, and we want the good people to get good things. If you were part of Garrett's class, he called it the world of Deuteronomy. I've always called it the world of the Proverbs, but it basically means the same thing. If you look at the book of Proverbs, it's black and white. There's no gray area in the book of Proverbs. You do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad. That's it. And everybody who reads the book of Proverbs knows it's not really true. If you've lived your life on this earth, you know that bad things happen to good people. And you know that great things happen to bad people sometimes. So I think it's frustrating for us sometimes. We want that to be the case. And the author of Genesis doesn't give us that satisfaction, not because he doesn't want to give us the satisfaction, but simply because he's got a story to tell. And it includes these stories. And he's not pausing to make those moral judgments. He's not pausing to tell us this is sinful, they got punished, this person's righteous, so everything great is going to everything that's going to happen to them is going to be great. He simply tells us there's separation. God's trying to reconcile. He uses nobodies. He turns into somebodies to make that happen. And here's how that came about. Any other question or comment? And when you?
I was just thinking that we only heard about Lot's wife when they were fleeing, and then she turned into a pillar of salt.
Mm-hmm.
When he was offering up his daughters to be raped, there was no mention of her at all. And then she's fleeing. They're all fleeing, and then she turns into so. And it's almost like if that the author inserted her to say there was a mother, there was a wife, there was a mother. and she's out of the story as quickly as she's in, and then
You're right.
Had she not,
She appears only to turn into a pillar of salt.
she
in our
appears
story.
exactly, and had she not been turned into a salt, died whatever way, what happened would not have happened. I mean, I'm not saying it's like,
Yeah.
like you're saying it's God's plan, but had their mother been alive and they were all a happy little family struggling,
Yeah.
what the daughters did would not have happened because the mother would have been there.
Yeah.
So
that's a-
you
that's a
kind of
good
just
point.
wonder.
Yeah,
what the
but you're
author
also right. Back at the beginning, what you said, it is a little strange. You know, it's like Lot's like, "Here's my daughters. Feel free to rape them," and nothing bad seems to happen to him. And then all of a sudden, Lot's wife is like running away, fleeing. There's fire and brimstones raining from the heavens. She's like, "Oh my goodness!" and kind of glances back, and boom, turned pillar of salt. It's like, well, that hardly seems fair. Like why? Like, there's a discrepancy there. I think that doesn't. It seems a little out of whack. So yeah, any other question or comment? Yeah, Mom.
There are a lot of missing pieces in that story, aren't there? I mean, the daughters had fiancés that didn't believe. They were warned. They didn't believe that this destruction was going to happen. So they were traumatized, right? Dealing with a lot of loss. They lost their boyfriends. They lost their mother, and Anyway, but my question is so you had said earlier when Abraham and Lot divided, and so I think you had said, and on the map, I think it pointed out where Sodom was, like when Lot got kidnapped and so forth. Do we know, like archaeologically today, exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah were? And if so, how do we know that?
Yeah,
or
we
don't
got
know
an
that?
idea. There's really a couple places that are the most likely. One's actually at the very top of the Dead Sea today, kind of near the city of Jericho, and the other's actually towards the bottom of the Dead Sea, where that pillar called Lot's wife is actually located, kind of towards where the bottom end of the Dead Sea. If you've been to Israel with me or elsewhere, it's kind of down towards when we went to Masada and then swam in the Dead Sea at the end of that day. It'd be just a little bit south of there. So yeah, there's some prominent places, and we see that just in some of the cities down there that we can tell they were destroyed by earthquakes, they were burned. So yeah, there's some likely candidates. There's always something new coming about every couple of years that I read, kind of making the case for one over the other. But yeah, there's some likely candidates for the cities. Any other question or comment? So chapter 21. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. So our English doesn't capture this, but in the beginning there, in the Hebrew, it says, after all these things. You know, in our English here, or at least in the NIV, it says, now the Lord was gracious. Doesn't really capture it. It says, after all these things. It's kind of the author of Genesis is using that phrase to basically say, oh man, finally. Like at long last, against all odds, it seems, finally this promise that God had given to Abraham finally comes true, finally happens. God finally fulfills that promise. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. Verse 3, Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So verse 8, the child, Isaac, grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. So it's children at that time were probably weaned at 3 to 5 years old. The reason it was a big deal, this is sad to say, but in that day and age, infant mortality was so common that parents often did not really get connected with their children for the first couple years. They would, obviously they cared for them and stuff, but they often would not try to kind of get to know their kid or treat their kid as somebody who is going to live a long life because they had seen so many times children die. So a child reaching the age of weaning was a big deal. So Abraham, it's not just like Isaac's like some spoiled rich kid or something whose dad just throws him a party for any reason. There's a reason that this is a big deal. Verse 9, but Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son. Oh, we skipped over. We'll come back to this next week. There's another story of Abraham telling Sarah to say she's his sister, not his wife. We'll see Isaac and Rebekah do the same thing next week, so we'll come back to that. A picture of Abraham and Sarah. This one says, I chose this one just because obviously it portrays Abraham and Sarah as particularly old. And so, you know, you'd look at this, I mean, in our day and age, you look at this and say, oh, that's the great-grandparents, you know. But that was not the case for them, which, again, you know, I like this picture, too, because of the smiles on both their faces. Because, you know, Abraham laughed at the absurdity. Sarah laughed at the absurdity. She laughs again now that he's actually born. And so they're kind of, it's almost like this picture of they kind of just giggle to themselves that they can't even believe that this is happening. So here's I couldn't find any actual like paintings of this or artwork of this scene, which seems a little odd, but so I had to use this like cartoon one. But this is Ishmael mocking Isaac. A couple of things here. One, you can tell, I mean, Isaac's supposed to be around 3 to 5 years old. Ishmael at this point would have been about 17. So you can see that here. The problem is we don't really know what the word mocking means. It certainly has to do with laughter, so there's kind of a play on words for the author of Genesis there to say that, you know, what Ishmael is doing to Isaac is kind of his name, laughing at him. But just to say that he's laughing at Isaac is, you know, you could see brothers laughing, you know, with each other, you know, poking fun at each other. You know, that's something that siblings do. So we don't really know why it upset Sarah so much. But in Jewish tradition, the mocking part here, what's going on is that Ishmael is telling Isaac that, basically Ishmael's saying, I'm better because I was circumcised at 13 years old. You were circumcised when you were 8 days old, which means you had no choice in the matter, but I chose to be part of the covenant. I chose to be part of our father's family by doing the circumcision at 13 years old, and you had no choice in the matter. You're just kind of born into it, basically, is what he's telling them. This would upset Sarah in the fact that she starts to think, oh, maybe that'll start to get in Abraham's mind. Maybe Abraham will think, oh, I should split the inheritance between Ishmael and Isaac. And Sarah doesn't want that to be the case, so she wants Hagar and Ishmael now sent away. Remember, the first time she mistreats and abuses Hagar, and Hagar leaves on her own. She flees. This time it's Sarah saying she needs to go away. It says in verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offering will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water and the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away. That's like 100 yards. For she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying. Remember, the first time she wanders out into the wilderness, God finds her. God hears her. Now it says God hears Ishmael. And again, Ishmael's name means God hears. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. So again, here's some pictures of, you know, Hagar and her distress, being out in the wilderness, out of water, with Ishmael and the angel coming to her, and miraculously, you know, she finds a well to bring them both back to life, essentially. So again, here the question earlier about do we know where Ishmael ended up? When it says they're living in the desert of Paran, that's like the modern day Sinai Peninsula. And it says his mother got a wife for him from Egypt, where she was from. So her hometown, basically. So again, here we have Hagar being sent out or going out into the wilderness. At this point, seemingly left to die, at least from her perspective, before God, again, finding her, hearing her, seeing her. Remember, she's the one that gives God the name El Roi, the God who sees me. And again, God sees her in this instance and reminds her of the promise that he had given to her and, as a result, to her son Ishmael as well. Hagar's interesting. She's not just the first woman. She's the first person in the Bible to be visited by, basically a divine messenger, an angel here, that's separate from, God's visitations. She's also the first person to receive that. She's the first woman to receive the promise of that divine promise of descendants. Remember, the promise that's given to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and also kind of to Joseph later, is given to Hagar as well. So it's significant there for the author of Genesis to tell us about Hagar and what she means to this story. Are there any questions or comments about that? The next part, the last part of that chapter before we get to chapter 22, is just about this tree. It kind of shows that Abraham has prospered here in the land. Basically, these people near Beersheba decide to give him water, kind of perpetual rights to the water in the area. This picture here, if you've been to Israel, is at Beersheba. If you've been with me, we sat on the benches that this picture was taken from, basically looking at that well. The outside of the well obviously is not 4,000 years old, but the well itself, beneath what we see these bricks kind of surrounding, is an ancient well. We don't know if that's the actual well that this story is talking about, that Abraham makes this deal with the people in the area for water rights, but it is a well there at the Beersheba today that you can see. It's interesting, this story, only because about the water rights, that it shows the influence that Abraham had come to have in the area. Because I had a professor, when I was a student in Israel, I had a professor who said, if you look at every single battle and every single war that has ever been fought in the Holy Land, every single one of them was about water. And he said, to this day. If you look at the modern day fighting in that region of the world, it's often about you'll see it's often about the water. Usually having to do with the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Golan Heights, the water that exists in those areas. So Abraham being treated to these rights to water in this area shows the amount of influence that he now has there. So I want to start this next story in chapter 22 by just reading the story through. I'm going to read it through once, and then we'll go back and look at it together. But you can follow along if you want, but what I really want you to do is just listen to the story. It only takes a couple minutes to read. It's brief. It's one of the stories in our Bible that is honestly one of the most kind of complex or difficult to understand what's happening, but it's also one of the most important stories in our whole Bible. So what I want you to do is just listen and just because I think a lot of us when we think about this story, the binding of Isaac or the sacrifice of Isaac, this test of Abraham, we often just have simplified it in our minds. It's God tells Abraham, God's going to test Abraham, tells him to sacrifice his son Isaac. He goes to do it. God stops him at the last minute, and God says, "Good job, Abraham." It's usually, I think how most of us think of the story. So I don't know when the last time you actually read through it was or heard it read, but I want you to just listen and just in your mind think about What questions do you have about this story? Does something bother you about the story? What questions do you have about what's going on in this story? And, if you've got ethical questions about the story or theological questions about the story, that's great. I'll let you ask those as well. If that's kind of way deeper than you want to think, then think of it this way. When I read the story and you listen, think of yourself as a director of a movie. Your job is to make this scene as a director. So if you're hearing this story for the first time or the first time in a long time and you're the director of a movie, what questions are you going to ask about this story so that you can portray it? So after I read it, I'm going to ask you what questions or comments or concerns you have about it here. So this is chapter 22 of Genesis. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld me from me, your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through their offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. So, and this is, I'm just going to tell you, you can just kind of shout out your questions, because I'll repeat them back quickly. We don't have time to take the mic around, so. What's that? Yeah, probably one of the biggest questions I think might stand out to us, where's Sarah? Where in the world is Sarah in this entire story? How come we hear nothing of her? What else? What other questions do you have about this story? Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm clued in. Now I hear you. Yeah, Doug.
Why does God want to test Abraham in the first place, just to come full circle around to the same point he was before and reaffirm the promise that he's already given?
Yeah, why does God, for those of you listening at home, why does God want to test Abraham to begin with? Just to come, as Doug said, full circle back to the point of reiterating the same promise he had given him. It seems like a weird game. Like, what's this game that's being played here with God testing Abraham? What's the point in all this? Anything bother you, concern you, what questions you have, Anna? Yeah, I think that's one of the things that stands out most, too, is where's the fight in Abraham? Where in the world is the negotiation tactics he used for the wicked people of Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah.
In this instance, it's, sometime later God tested him. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," replied. When God said, "Take then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. You know, it's as if his wife had told him that the car needed to be serviced, you know, the next day. You know, it's like, that's simple. Like, hey, remember, we need to take the car. And, oh, yeah, and gets up early the next morning. It's like, just so matter of fact, it's like, where in the world is the protest? Abraham's sitting there bargaining with God. If I find 50 people in the righteous people in the wicked city, will you spare it? You shouldn't destroy a city for all the wicked people if there's righteous people in it too. That's not the kind of God you are. If I find 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, will you spare it? And God says yes. Here he says, incinerate your son. And Abraham starts preparing. You know, it's a great question. Like, where is it? Why doesn't he fight? Yeah, is the promise null and void by what you're asking me to do? After all this time, after the promise of, I begged you, God, just make the promise through Ishmael. And you said, no, it's going to be through Isaac. Finally, you have Sarah give birth to Isaac, and now you tell me to go kill that part of the promise. You know, I gave this, you know, we talked about it in the creation stories, that there's almost a disturbing switch from our point of view of God as creator to God as destroyer. He creates at the beginning and then destroys the earth through the flood. You know, we almost get that same picture here in this part of Genesis, that God creates this part of the promise, fulfills this part of the promise, and then immediately tells Abraham to destroy it, or soon after tells Abraham to destroy it. So I think it's another one of those aspects of the story that is disturbing for us. Yeah, okay? Yeah, that's certainly one way to view the story. We're going to talk about, you know, what options did Abraham have here, and you know, how should we be thinking of this story? And that's certainly one way to look at it. This is Abraham. You know, I think that's the traditional way to view the story too. Is this is just how good a faith Abraham had, that he would. But I think the question for us is still, but what did he think was going to happen? Guy, you had it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the comment is that several times God refers to Isaac not just as Abraham's son, but says your only son. I think for us, having just looked at the story of Ishmael, it goes like, wait, he's not his only son. You know, like, that's weird. And as Guy said, you know, it's this kind of a reminder that that's not who the promise is going to go through. Because I think you're right about that there's an aspect of saying your only son, because it's kind of like Abraham's already fought with God before about, why don't you just make the promise through Ishmael? And it's kind of a reminder of the promise isn't going to be through Ishmael. It's through Isaac, you know, your only son, that the promise can come through. It's not that he's his only son biologically, but it's the only son that the promise can be fulfilled through. And I think it makes for a more startling reminder, more jarring reminder of just what God is asking him to do. Because he's saying, you're reminding me, this is my only son. This is the only son the promise can come through, and you're telling me to destroy that. Yeah. In the second what?
Yeah, a second place. Like
In the second what?
Isaac was taking the heart of Abraham, and Abraham was not giving God's place. And because when he said that your only son, the one that you loved, so maybe God wanted to test him. If he really loved God more than he loved his son.
Yeah, I think I think that's fair to say, and I think going along with that, the author of Genesis felt the same way you do, in the sense that it's almost like the author of Genesis wrote the story, read it back, and thought, this sounds way too horrific. I have to tell them up front it's a test. You know, it said, God sets about to test Abraham. That's something we know, but Abraham doesn't know. And it's almost like the author of Genesis realizes how bad the story sounds from the start, God being creator to destroyer, and cluing us in as the reader and listener. This is going to be a test of Abraham of what's happening here. Alan?
Abraham told them that they're going to come back. So I think the author is also saying that, or describing Abraham's faith in God, because he told those servants that they left behind that they'll be coming back. Although Abraham already know that God is going to, is asking him to sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, and that is one of the things that seems to be missing from the story is that Abraham tells the two servants, we're gonna come back, him and Isaac. So what are we to make of that part of the story? Is Abraham lying because he's expecting to go through with the sacrifice, believing that God is really asking him to sacrifice his son? So he's lying to the servants who maybe he fears that will try and stop him? Or does he believe in the end Isaac's going to come back with him one way or the other? Maybe that means that he believes that God is going to stop him at the last minute, and that's what he believes, and kind of is going along with this test, knowing that God's going to stop him. It could also mean that he knows Isaac's coming back with him because he knows to himself, if God doesn't stop this, I'm going to stop it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that probably at the beginning of next week. But yeah, Bob?
Yeah, well, he would be lying to Isaac himself, because Isaac's like, where's the lamb? And he's like, well, God's going to provide it. He didn't say the lamb's you. He says God's going to provide a lamb. We do get an interpretation of what at least the author of Hebrews thought was going through Abraham's mind. And the author of Hebrews says that he had such faith that even if he slew him, God would raise him up.
Yeah, and that actually has led to traditions that Isaac did get sacrificed and die. And that's why, if you'll notice later at the end of the story, it says Abraham comes down and leaves with the two servants. It never says anything about Isaac. We don't know where Isaac is at that point. One of the suggestions that's been made and one of the traditions that's believed is that Isaac really was sacrificed and God rose him from the dead. Now, certainly you can see from the Christian perspective why certain Christian communities, not this isn't like Orthodox belief, not most Protestants, Catholics, and everything don't believe that, but there's a lot of Christian communities over the years that have believed that, and you can see why, because it lines up with the parallels between the life of Isaac and the life of Christ, and the death of Christ, and if Isaac really died in that way. From the Jewish perspective, the word that's used there for burnt offering or whole offering is olah. It's the word for Holocaust. So when you say Holocaust, what that means is burnt offering. And that's the word that's used there, that God tells Abraham to Holocaust Isaac. It's what most Jews today, though, actually, because a burnt offering has a purpose, most Jews nowadays don't refer to the Holocaust as Holocaust. They call it Shoah. Shoah means senseless destruction. And so if you go to Israel and you go to like one of the Holocaust memorials or museums, you often see them call it Ha-Shoah, the Shoah, the senseless destruction. Because to them, Holocaust has a purpose. It's a burnt offering. It's a whole offering made to God, and there's a purpose to it. So to call what happened to the Jewish people under the Nazi regime a purposeful sacrifice, I think disturbs Jewish people today, and so they have gone away from calling it Holocaust. But that's the word that's used there. God tells Abraham to Holocaust Isaac. Well, Larry? it's a great point. Larry's saying he's old. Isaac's old enough to know what's going on. Now, if you're the casting director of that movie that needs to have, if you're the director and you tell the casting director, find me somebody to play Isaac, what's your first question going to be? How old? How old is the actor that I'm looking for? Like, here, is it a toddler? Like, oftentimes I think, here's a picture here. That Isaac certainly looks very young there. So how old is Isaac when all this is taking place? He seems to, certainly he's having a conversation with Abraham, and he's observant, he's talkative, he's inquisitive. Where's the lamb that's supposed to be having here? He's old enough to carry wood on his back to go up there. So he's probably at least a teenager. He's as old as 37, because in the story that immediately follows, it tells us Sarah is 127, and she had him at 90. We don't know how much time, if any, has passed between then. So most people would say Isaac's between like 17 and 37, or 13 and 37, something like that. Certainly, as Larry said, old enough to know what's going on. And I think there's some aspect of Isaac's obedience in this story that we usually miss or don't focus on. That we talk about Abraham's faith, but how much of our story really is about Isaac's obedience? He goes from this very talkative, inquisitive person, where's the lamb that we're supposed to be sacrificing, to basically immediate silence right after that. Is he silent because he doesn't know what's going to happen to him? Is he silent because he knows what's going to happen to him and accepts it? Is he the one that is really offering himself as the sacrifice, less so than Abraham offering him? I think there's a lot about Isaac that we don't always talk about in this story, because usually in our minds we always picture him as very young, a child that doesn't, is kind of oblivious to what's happening. Dad, why are you, why are you tying my hands? In this very confused and everything else. But if Isaac is a grown man, or at least a teenager, and has shown how smart he is just by what we see him asking and observing around him, there's no way that he didn't know what was about to happen to him once he was bound and placed up onto the altar. Yeah, something on Zoom?
Liesel and Ish ask, Isaac is strong enough to carry the wood and must have had an idea that he was to be sacrificed. So was this also a test for Isaac as a willing sacrifice?
Yeah, we're never told by the author of Genesis before or after that it was a test of Isaac. The test is of Abraham, but I think what you're saying there is right, that there's some aspect to this story that needs to kind of see Isaac as praiseworthy. It's extremely unlikely that he wouldn't have known what was happening to him. So is this more of a story that we should be celebrating Isaac's choice? And that really matches up. I'll close with this thought because we're a couple minutes over. I hope you can come next week or be online next week as we really dig more into this story. Obviously, you can see that there's a lot to kind of unpack here or think about. So I really hope you can be a part of it next week. But I'll close with this thought that certainly from the perspective of Isaac, there's an aspect to him offering himself as the sacrifice. And I think that lines up in a lot of ways with us with the story about Jesus. You have Isaac carrying the wood on his back, just like Jesus carried the cross, the wooden cross on his back. You certainly have this aspect of being a willing sacrifice. And certainly, I think one thing that's interesting, though, is you have, in the story with Abraham and Isaac, there appears to be real separation that happens between Abraham and Isaac following the story. We'll get into it more next week, but for one, I already mentioned, Abraham comes down and leaves with the servants to go to Beersheba. There's no sign of Isaac anywhere. Where did he go? It seems like from this story and what follows that the relationship between Abraham and Isaac is permanently damaged. They don't ever speak to each other again. It tells us that Isaac mourns deeply his mother's death, but when Abraham dies, he just simply goes and does his sonly duty by making sure his father is buried, but they don't ever speak to each other again in the story. Even when Abraham needs to find a wife for Isaac, he tells his servant to go find the wife. There's no interaction after this. It seems like there might be some permanent damage to the relationship between Abraham and Isaac. Now contrast that with the separation in their story with the story we see of Jesus not only being reconciled and reunified with God the Father, but in telling us in the book of Matthew, lo, I am with you always. So there's the separation in the story with Abraham and Isaac, but the unity and togetherness of Christ with us and Christ with the Father that we find in the story of Jesus. So again, I hope you can take part next week because we still have a lot to look at. Next week, I teased last week, does this lead to Abraham and Sarah's divorce? Are they divorced after this, or do they stay together? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about, did Abraham fail the test? In a lot of Jewish tradition and thinking, they say Abraham failed the test. He should have fought with God. He should have said, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, this is not the kind of God you are. And I remember hearing a Jewish rabbi talk about this story years ago, and she closed with the thought in her commentary on the story that I pray that if God ever asked me to do this, I'd have the strength to tell him no. And it was startling to me then. It might be startling for you but we'll talk about that next week, what that might mean, to talk about whether Abraham passed the test or failed the test. So hope to see you next week, either in person or online. And thanks for being here.
The sky is so cold, I feel you slow. Your mind is not like it was before. I delete all, put thoughts on hold. I try to feel you, but you are gone. The fire's cold inside your soul. I feel the weight of what we were. I delete all, put thoughts on hold. I try to feel you. Were bright, I felt the shine. Missed the summers we used to hide. The city lights on this blue night. to my friends, I'll leave again. I'll live again.